Tom Brady has finally put words to something a lot of people had suspected but never really heard from him directly. It wasn't just age, statistics, or the usual time to move on cliché that pushed him into retirement. It was his life off the field, catching up with the demands of life on it. On a recent episode of The Herd with Colin Cowherd, Brady opened up in a way we don't often see from someone who has spent more than 2 decades being the face of an entire sport. He admitted that what was happening inside his home, with his family and his marriage, was a major factor in calling time on his NFL career, even though his body and his arm were still capable of playing at a high level. When Cowherd asked him the question that's been floating around since he walked away, why retire when you clearly could still play, Brady didn't hide behind generic answers. He went straight to what his final year with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers really felt like. He described that last season as tough, not just in the usual football sense of injuries and game plans, but on a deeply personal level. He said he was dealing with a lot of family issues, and that those pressures drained him in a way that went beyond sore ribs or a tired shoulder. That's a big admission coming from someone like Brady. This is a player whose entire brand was built on outworking everyone, obsessing over film, controlling every variable he could control. To hear him say that those family problems took a lot out of him in terms of his ability to keep playing shows just how heavy that load must have been. After 23 seasons, he explained he didn't feel like he was missing out on anything by walking away. When you've done it for that long and achieved as much as he has, at some point the calculation changes. He was careful to make one thing clear. His love for football never disappeared. You could hear it in how he talked about the game. That fire to compete, to be in the building, to prepare was still there. But the emotional and mental cost of staying at that level, on top of what was going on with his personal life, created a different kind of fatigue. It wasn't the "I'm too old to do this" story. It was a "I'm pulled in too many directions to give this the total focus it demands." One of the most interesting parts of what he shared was how his relationship with the game changed as he got older. He said that toward the end, he actually found himself enjoying practice more than the actual games. At first glance, that might sound strange. Fans always imagine athletes living for game day, the crowds, the lights, the pressure. But Brady described winning not as pure joy, but as relief. That's a very different emotional experience. Think about that for a second. When victories stop feeling like satisfaction and start feeling like the removal of a burden, you know you're in a different phase. He acknowledged that sometimes they'd win, but not in the dominant way he expected or demanded from himself and his team. Even in victory, he wasn't necessarily happy. It became another layer of pressure, another pile of expectations met but not fully enjoyed. For a lot of longtime pros, that mental shift is the real sign it's time to go, more than anything the stat sheet might say. Brady was still capable of making the throws. His arm didn't suddenly fall off. Physically, he was better than most quarterbacks half his age. But if every game feels like a test you pass rather than a moment you genuinely savor, and at the same time you're going home to a life that's unraveling under the strain, the equation starts tilting toward retirement whether you like it or not. He also used a comparison that any runner, or honestly anyone who's been stuck in a long grind, will understand. He likened his NFL career to running a marathon. He said everyone loves the first 4 miles, that initial burst of excitement, adrenaline, and newness, and everyone loves the last 2 miles when you can see the finish line and feel the end coming. But it's those middle 20 miles that test you. The long, repetitive, grinding stretch where you're too far in to quit, but still too far from the end to relax. That metaphor fits his 23 years almost perfectly. The start of his career was a fairy tale. Late-round draft pick, steps in for an injured Drew Bledsoe, wins a Super Bowl, starts building a dynasty in New England. The final phase, in Tampa, felt like the last sprint. New team, new city, another championship to put an exclamation point on the resume, then the farewell. But in between, there were decades of constant preparation, playing deep into January and February year after year, carrying the expectations of an entire franchise, and being judged harshly for any season that didn't end with a Lombardi trophy. He collected more rings than any other quarterback, shattered records, and changed what we think is possible in terms of longevity. On the surface, it looks like nothing but success, yet when he talks about it now, you can hear how heavy that marathon became. Every January wasn't just another playoff run, it was another stretch where his life had to be fully about football, whatever was going on off the field. When you overlay that with the reality of his personal life in those final years, it becomes easier to see why he reached the point he did. During his time with the Buccaneers, his marriage with Gisele Bündchen was under constant scrutiny. There were reports and speculation everywhere. Eventually, the divorce became public. That's a life change that would shake anyone, and he was going through it in front of cameras while also trying to be the calming, confident veteran leader everyone in the locker room looked to. Brady didn't go into all the details of that on Cowherd's show, and honestly, he didn't need to. Just acknowledging that family issues drained his ability to keep going is enough to paint a picture. It tells you that this wasn't just about a guy checking his bank account, looking at his stats and saying, "I've done enough." It was about him realizing he couldn't be everywhere at once anymore, that there was a cost being paid outside the stadium that was too high to ignore. For fans, this kind of honesty cuts through the usual polished talking points we hear from big-name athletes. Fans see the trophies, the luxury lifestyle, the social media posts, and often think it's all upside. But what Brady said on that show is a reminder that the pressure doesn't disappear once you've made it. In some ways, it only grows. Every season you add to your legacy, the bar gets raised again. Every sacrifice you and your family made in years 1 to 10 gets repeated in years 11 to 23. He also touched on something that resonates far beyond sports, the idea that success can become a trap if you're not careful. Winning can become something you're expected to do, not something you get to enjoy. When that happens, it's like being stuck in those middle miles of the marathon, where the joy is secondary to the obligation.
Brady's reflections put some of the decisions we all saw in a slightly new light. Remember, he initially retired, then briefly came back, extending his career one more season. That back and forth became a talking point on its own. People debated whether he'd made the right call, whether he should have stayed retired the first time. Hearing him now, it's easier to imagine how conflicted he must have been. On one side, the identity he'd had for most of his life, Tom Brady, NFL quarterback. On the other, a personal life that clearly needed attention, and a body and mind that had already carried the burden for 23 years. When he says now that he doesn't feel like he missed anything by retiring, that's a powerful statement from someone who has always chased every possible edge. It suggests he's at peace with the decision in a way he maybe wasn't when he briefly walked away the first time. Now, with distance, he can appreciate the sheer length and intensity of what he did, and accept that there was never going to be a perfect exit. His comments also give fans a bit more insight into why he looked the way he did in that final season in Tampa. The numbers were still solid, but there were moments where he just looked worn down. Now we know that wasn't just age, it was a man trying to hold together two worlds at once, and realizing work could no longer come first at all costs. There's another layer to all this too. In modern sports, we talk a lot more about mental health, emotional strain, and the pressures that come with being in the spotlight. Brady, for most of his career, wasn't one of the athletes speaking openly on those topics. He was more old school in his public persona, laser-focused, team-first, non-dramatic. So to hear someone with that image now pull back the curtain and admit how much his family situation wore him down adds weight to the broader conversation. It shows that even the most successful, the ones who look like they've figured it all out, are still human beings trying to balance ambition with relationships, work with home life, legacy with personal happiness. That's something a lot of people can relate to, even if their jobs don't involve Super Bowls and national broadcasts. As fans look back on his career now, these comments aren't going to replace the highlight reel. People will still think of the comeback against Atlanta, the early Patriots years, the move to Tampa, the final parade of statistics. But this new layer adds context to the final chapter. It turns the end of his journey from a simple "he got old and retired" into something more real. He reached a point where the emotional toll of continuing wasn't worth the cost, even for the greatest quarterback of all time.
So when you hear him compare those 23 years to a marathon and talk about how the middle miles are where it really gets hard, it's not just a clever analogy, it's his way of saying, I carried this as far as I could, through more than most people will ever know, and I chose to stop before it took too much of me and my family. In a sports culture that sometimes treats athletes like they're machines built to entertain us until they fall apart, that choice matters. Brady's decision, in the way he's now explaining it, reinforces that even at the highest level, there's a line where life outside the arena has to come first, and hearing that from someone who lived and breathed football the way he did might be the clearest reminder yet that no amount of rings or records can completely shield you from the personal cost of staying in the game forever.